Hello watch enthusiasts! Now the world of chronographs, whether one looks at something very affordable or the real world of high horology, one finds that there are several big names which tend to come up, notable examples such as the Omega Speedmaster or the Rolex Daytona, which really do fill out this category as far as the chronographs which people tend to go to when they're looking to buy. However, in today's video I'd like to speak about a different range of chronographs, chronographs which come from brands producing really excellent products with very high quality, but which are often overlooked by general consumers and watch collectors alike, and these range from pieces which were perhaps under-publicised in the case of one dive watch in this video, as well as other pieces which are simply off the radar in terms of being produced by smaller brands, or simply by brands which don't receive the same coverage which others perhaps do. But all the watches in this video provide fantastic quality, and a really beautiful example of a chronograph which is perhaps not the most obvious choice on first glance. But perhaps most importantly, all of these watches offer fantastic value, which is always an important element when looking at buying a watch or simply appreciating a watch in its respective price range. But before I begin the video, I would of course like to encourage you to like, share and subscribe if you find this video useful or interesting, and also to be able to access more content which otherwise wouldn't be available here on the YouTube channel. Do follow me on Instagram at the address which is now on the screen. Now the first pieces I'd like to speak about are really competitors for the affordable realms of chronographs. And these are watches which compete in the same sort of market as Dan Henry chronographs, which are also a very valid choice if you're looking for an affordable piece. However, this brand, Roue, which is a brand inspired by motor racing and motorsport in general, as is seen in the name, which means wheel in French, one sees the CHR, which is their chronograph. And in my eyes, this piece is a watch which has a little bit more to say than other watches at the same sort of price range, because it's beautifully designed and the execution of it really does show attention to detail which you just wouldn't expect at this sort of price range. And this watch is 41.5 by 10.9mm thick, and this means the watch is very wearable in terms of being very slender on the wrist, but also thanks to its very 70s curved front, it means the watch actually slips underneath any sort of cuff extremely easily. It's also 5 atmospheres water resistant, so has enough to resist splashes, but is of course not designed to be a dive watch. But where this watch is designed to shine is in its design and its aesthetics, because the piece does take on this very 60s and 70s look, with this barrel-shaped case which is mostly bead blasted, with some brushed elements in the form of bevels, and also a caseback which is brushed with this checkered pattern to look like the flag one sees at the end of a race. And the detailing on the case is fantastic, whether you look at the caseback with its detailing, or if you look at the pushes and crown, which have been designed very carefully to fit the case, for example the crown being very thin but still having the grip to be pulled out, making it very easy to use but also very aesthetically pleasing. Looking at the front of this watch, the design really has continued very well, with, despite a price tag of only $260 US, a sapphire crystal on the front which is also anti-reflective, which means that you have this fantastic visibility. Also, the dial itself is beautifully detailed and very, very well constructed. The balance is there despite the fact that it is very clearly an asymmetrical dial with this abnormal layout of the subdials which is characteristic of some of the movements used in the 60s and 70s. Also the Roue branding on the dial I think is fantastic and gives you a very clear appearance but still gives you all the readings you might need, with the two subdials displaying the minutes for the chronograph, with of course the seconds in the centre and a 20th of a second counter at 12, which gives you much greater precision when timing something than you would have if you were using a mechanical chronograph. Also, one does have the date placed on the dial, which has a quick-set function and a tachymeter, whilst the dial itself has these yellow additions and detailing which is fantastically well printed and really does capture the era beautifully. Inside this watch you find a Miyota caliber, which in my eyes is a highly underrated movement in its own right, because it's a quartz movement which has a metal build as opposed to a plastic quartz movement, and gives you this chronograph function where you have a smooth tick to the second hand rather than these individual ticks, which I think tend to please the eye far more. Also, having that sub-second counter is very helpful to be able to see the fractions of a second down to a 20th of a second, as well as the fact that this movement has the function where if you pull the crown out and press the pushers, you can realign the hands if you happen to drop the watch or the watch is subjected to a heavy shock which were to displace the hands, which I think adds a certain amount of peace of mind and really takes advantage of the fact that a quartz movement can have these functions, whilst the watch also has this semi-flyback, which means that if you want to stop the chronograph at once, you can simply press the reset button. And I think it's a very good choice for this watch as well, giving it a very affordable setup for servicing, but also making the watch very, very slim. And coming with a variety of different straps, which are all beautiful quality, I think it's a fantastic deal for the price of $260 and something which really should be appreciated more. This next piece I'd like to speak about is a model which comes from a very well-known brand, Longines, and many people know the Hydroconquest from this brand. However, I feel that this new version has somewhat been ignored as a result of the amount of support and attention gained by its three-hand counterpart. And this Longines Hydroconquest chronograph represents a real change for this range, for the brand, because it's a watch which introduces a number of new features, but also cleans up the aesthetic fantastically, and creates what I feel is a really phenomenal option for someone who's looking for an automatic chronograph in the form of a real professional dive watch. Because this piece is 41mm in diameter in stainless steel with brushed and polished finishes and a ceramic bezel now, which is a new feature for this new range. And the watch itself has taken on a much more modern form, although certain elements of the original design remain, notably the 300-meter water resistance, and also the integration of the pushers into the crown guards, which I think look fantastic and give this watch both a modern but also very accepted aesthetic, which I think will work for a great deal of people, as something which is attractive and not too extreme, but still does present something which looks very clean and very fresh. And with that 41mm diameter, I feel it's a watch which isn't too large and isn't too small, especially in a world where chronographs of the diving variety are so often very, very large. And with regards to the options with this piece, one sees a black version, a grey version and a blue version, all of which have sunburst dials and more simple applied indices, which still retain the aesthetics of the original Hydroconquest, but give it a much more modern look and I think clean it up significantly. But looking underneath that sapphire crystal and past the ceramic bezel, and also moving on from the simplification of the dial, one also sees the fact the dial has been very carefully detailed. And the dial, whether one goes for the blue, the grey, or the black versions, one sees this tricompax layout with the subdials placed on the bottom of the dial, which is rather abnormal for a watch from the Swatch group, which we usually use a Velocity 7750, thus giving it that vertical arrangement to the chronograph subdials. But on this watch they haven't gone for that, and have instead created a very interesting aesthetic, where you have a luminous running second hand on the left, which allows the watch to be able to display the fact that it's running, which is a crucial aspect to a dive watch, and it's attractive and also helpful to see the fact that this has been maintained on a watch with a dial which is much more busy as a result of the chronograph. Also, the date has been maintained, placed at the 4:30 position, and in red one sees the two subdials for the chronograph, as well as the red second hand for that chronograph too, which I think unifies the coloration of the dial very, very well, and makes it both legible and also very clean. I feel that with this watch it's very important to note the movement used, because it's not a conventional Velocity 7750, as you will have noted from the fact that the subdials are arranged in this particular layout. And this means that this is a movement which is the L688, which is a movement made exclusively for Longines by ETA, and I think that should be noted because it is important to realise this is not a movement used by all the brands which have access to ETA movements. And this is a movement which retains some of the Velocity 7750's parts and thus its features, such as running at 4 Hz rather than being reduced to 3.5 Hz, as has been seen on other movements from Longines to extend the power reserve, yet the power reserve has still been extended with this watch to a certain degree, to 54 hours, giving you a full 2 days, plus a little margin. Except other changes have been made to this movement too. Notably there is proprietary Longines decoration to the movement, which is nice to see, although of course this watch has a solid case back, but nonetheless the fact that care like that has been taken is appreciated. And it has a column wheel too, which gives you a very crisp activation to the chronograph, which you wouldn't have with a cam. Similarly, this watch has automatic winding and of course the date, but importantly this movement is something which is relatively new, and one sees this in some watches like the Avigation Big Eye from Longines, but never at this sort of price range, with the price for this watch on the bracelet rather than the rubber strap being £1,770, and that Big Eye being well over £2,000 on a leather strap, shows the fact that this watch really is a fantastic value piece. And so with its pricing, as well as the fact that this watch has that high water resistance, the screw-down crown, and this rather interesting chronograph movement, in addition to a brilliant design and a ceramic bezel, I think it's difficult to argue that this watch is anything but a really fantastic option for a multi-purpose chronograph, whether you want it for diving or simply to go skiing or another outdoor activity of that nature. I think this piece is a really fantastic choice. The next watch I'd like to speak about comes from a brand based in the Black Forest in Germany, which has a very illustrious history in terms of producing chronographs, but is more known for their pilot's chronographs, notably their monopusher chronographs, for example, which inspired the Type 20 production of pilot's watches for the French Air Force by Breguet and a number of other brands in the 1950s. But this brand has continued on to produce a number of very interesting pieces, and this piece I'd like to speak about today is the Racemaster, their racing watch, which does differ somewhat from their pilot's chronographs, but offers a great deal more, I think, in terms of being a multi-purpose and I think highly underrated chronograph. The design of this watch is very, very different, and I think you could say unique, because it's 45mm in diameter by 16mm thick, making it certainly a sizable piece. And the Racemaster does come in 3 variants, but they all share the same dimensions in that regard. And they're produced from HDS Pro steel, which is a form of steel which in this case has a primarily brushed execution on this watch, which is 100 times more scratch resistant than normal 316L, meaning that this watch will really be able to take a pounding, which is a fantastic aspect of a watch which is designed to be bashed around the inside of a car, allowing the watch to be a piece which you can relax in terms of damaging and be able to enjoy to its fullest potential. Aside from that, the design of the case is unique, as I've said, with a signed Hanhart crown and a case back which has both a propeller and some racing details such as curbs, as well as checkering on it to resemble those key elements of motor racing. Also, one sees a concave-style bezel and this asymmetrical layout for the pushers, whether one goes for the standard version, the flyback, or the monopusher. And the only difference there externally is that the monopusher has a single chronograph pusher at the 2 o'clock position, whereas the standard version and the flyback have 2 pushers. And these feature the characteristic normal silver and red colour for these pushers to be easily differentiated, with anodized aluminium being chosen for the material for that bottom pusher. And the top pusher has been displaced somewhat upwards to be able to make it more accessible, necessitating a great deal of change to the inside of the case to allow that to be possible. Aside from that, this watch does have a 100-metre water resistance, making it very wearable on a daily basis, but also it has a domed anti-reflective sapphire crystal on the front, which is anti-reflective on the inside as well as the outside to allow it to be the ideal form of sapphire to make the watch very legible, which is ideal for being used in the cockpit or in the driving seat. But the inside of this watch displays several very interesting features as well, because looking at the dial, this piece has a variety of dial variants depending upon the version, because the standard version has white accents on the dial, whilst the flyback has orange accents and the monopusher blue. And these dials come with a general layout across the range, with this bicompax layout for the chronograph subdials, as well as having these red hands with some luminous elements applied to the dial as well as on the hands. And the differences do start to begin there, because on the standard version as well as the flyback, one sees a coaxial subdial on the left, and this displays the running seconds for the time, as well as the chronograph 12 hours, with the chronograph minutes displayed on the opposite side of the dial, and the seconds in the centre, giving the most fantastic of legibility, whilst one sees on the monopusher chronograph a simplified format with a simple 30-minute chronograph counter. And the inside of these watches do show a great deal of attention to detail and care for a brand which one can't forget has only 2 watchmakers and only makes 1,000 watches per year. And the movements inside these watches do vary from model to model, but all share the base of either a Sleater SW500 or a Veltri 7750, which are both automatic chronograph movements which are in fact identical, with the exception of some minor details and changes. These also all run at 4 Hz, giving you 8 ticks per second, and are all automatic, of course, with a cam and lateral clutch. But each movement does vary somewhat, with the normal GT, that's to say the standard chronograph version, having 35 joules, and of course those coaxial seconds and hours, whilst the GTM, the monopusher, has 31 joules, and one also sees on the flyback version, which means that if you press the bottom pusher, the chronograph second hand jumps to 0 and restarts immediately. This version has 34 joules, and of course those additional functions. And these are all achieved through the use of Lejouperet modules applied to the surface of the movements to give this new layout, as well as these new functions. Of course, these watches won't be for everybody. They're a size which means that many people will find them to be a little bit on the large side, despite having a very short lug-to-lug length, but also their weight, and also the fact that they have a rather quirky design will mean that they won't be for every buyer. However, for those who do appreciate the unique nature of these watches being produced by a brand which really does have that personal touch which one so often seeks in the watch industry, and a quality which simply can't be ignored, I think these make a phenomenal option, irrespective of which model you happen to go for, with prices ranging from €2,840 all the way up to €3,340 for that flyback version. This penultimate watch I'd like to speak about is a really beautiful example of an independent watchmaker getting it absolutely right, because this is the Habring Chrono-Felix. And Habring is a brand which is not very well known at all, but amongst those who are interested in IWC chronographs, they really are very well known, because Richard Habring, one of the two individuals who founded Habring Squared, himself and his wife Maria, founding the company, was a key character in the creation of the double chronographs for IWC, because he developed the Vedra 7750 into a movement which could have a split-second chronograph without comprehensive rebuilds of the movement and major changes. And once the patents on that had expired, he incorporated that design of his own into his own watches under the brand Habring. And this is where the Doppel-Felix, the most well-known chronograph by the brand, came from. But this watch, the Chrono-Felix, comes in the form of a sort of a younger brother, if you will, to that Doppel-Felix, as it's a monopusher chronograph which I like to think of as the thinking man's chronograph, because it's a remarkable example of something which is very simple but beautifully executed. The design of this watch is truly beautiful, with a 38.5mm case in brushed and polished steel, with a 10.5mm thickness, making it rather slender for a chronograph, and of course with an exhibition caseback and domed sapphire on the front. It also has drilled lugs, which give an interesting element to this watch, which appears somewhat vintage. And the dial on this watch is a thing of real beauty, because the front of this watch has a grained silver dial, which gives you this matted effect with these exquisite subdials as well, simply showing the seconds and the 30 minutes of the chronograph. And there is a great deal of variation available with this dial, which is entirely handmade, with either thermally blued hands or black hands, in addition to the 12 on the dial being available either in black or red, depending upon what you happen to like. And so the dial is very, very simple, but I think works fantastically well to simply show you a beautiful level of detailing and quality, which is really what you expect, because I feel that very often watches try to hide certain inconsistencies with complexity, whereas with this watch there's absolutely nowhere to hide and nothing that needs to be hidden. And the movement inside the watch is a rather lovely piece as well, because it's the A11C-H1, and this bases its design on the Vedra 7750 because this is the area of expertise of Richard Habring. However, it comprehensively redesigns it, and notably this movement is entirely made by Habring, which is something which you wouldn't expect, and certainly for a brand of this size, which only makes a couple of hundred watches a year, you really do note the quality with this piece, as the automatic winding has been removed, instead making this watch a simple manually wound watch, with skeletonization visible on the movement itself, with the ability to view through the balance cock, for example, to be able to really examine the movement in detail, which has a machined surface which is beautiful to behold, with beveled edges and blued elements too, as well as a golden balance, which is a nice touch. The movement beats at the Vedra 7750's characteristic beat rate of 28,800 vibrations per hour, or 8 ticks per second, with 25 joules and 48 hours of power reserve. But really with this watch it's the care taken, because despite having a cam activation for the chronograph and a lateral clutch rather than a column wheel and vertical clutch, it's the care taken with this movement which is impressive, the care taken to produce this watch entirely by hand, and with real care to make this watch as luxurious but as beautifully made as it possibly can be, which I must say I respect enormously. And admittedly this watch doesn't have that double split-second chronograph which you see on the Doppel-Felix, and which is characteristic of the brand, but with this watch for about €1,000 less than that watch, you get a much more simple and in many ways much more elegant piece, which is more versatile and more usable on more occasions, which is something I respect enormously. And so whilst this watch won't appeal to everyone, I think it's an exquisite example of handmade watchmaking with a price of €6,250. The final piece I'd like to speak about is a model which is very widely respected, but I feel underrated when compared to other models at a similar sort of price range, or indeed watches costing a bit more, because this is the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Control Chronograph, a watch which in its most modern form, this syringe-handed exquisite piece, one sees a really beautiful example of phenomenal watchmaking, which really is at the level of the Holy Trinity, the Vacheron Constantin, Patek Philippe and Audemars Piguet sort of level, because this is a watch which is 40mm in diameter by 12.1mm thick, and is presented in this beautiful stainless steel case with a polished bezel, in addition to polished bevels down the edges of the lugs, and some brushed elements on the sides of the case as well, to break up the shape and give it a somewhat 1940s design, which I absolutely love with this piece. Except when you look at the dial through the domed sapphire crystal on the front, you see the fact that it is an exquisite example of a dress chronograph, but one which you could use every day. The dial of the watch has a mix of different finishes, from a very fine graining around the edge where one sees those markers for the hours, in addition to a matted area in the centre, as well as around the very edge of the dial, whilst one sees this sector style of dial which is very characteristic of those 1930s and 40s as far as a period goes, with numerals at 12 and 6. And the three-hand version of this watch has really been a major hit, but I can't help but feel the chronograph was never quite the same success, despite celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Master Control in the JLC line. And bearing in mind the Master Control is a revolutionary range for JLC, bearing in mind that it gave that 1,000-hour regulation for these watches through tests and other evaluations of the movements before they were sold, this really demonstrated accuracy like the brand hadn't done before. And this watch suppresses the addition of a subdial for the small seconds on this dial, instead simply giving you the 12 hours and the 30 minutes of the chronograph, and of course the chronograph seconds in the centre, with simply the hours and the minutes of the standard time being displayed. And this means that you have this perfectly symmetrical arrangement to the dial, with JLC at the top of the dial and simply automatic at the bottom. And I think also the addition of a tachymeter on this dial just gives that element of detail which this watch needed to give it this appearance of an all-purpose chronograph, but with such fantastic style, and those thermally blued syringe hands, which look as though they're vintage hands where the loom has fallen out, which gives fantastic elegance and real beauty. And with its small crown and squared pushers with those rounded elements on the top, this watch is hopelessly beautiful, I find, in terms of being something which is different to anything else at this sort of price range, but also with real pedigree within it. Because of course JLC is the watchmaker's watchmaker, in terms of being a brand which has produced movements for all three of the Holy Trinity brands, and very famously produced the JLC 920, which was that ultra-thin automatic movement which was used in the AP Royal Oak, as well as in the Patek Philippe Nautilus. But with this watch one sees a relatively modern calibre, the 751G, a movement which adheres to the 1,000-hour testing of the Master Control range, and is of course an in-house chronograph movement, with automatic winding running at 4 Hz, with 37 joules and 2 spring barrels to give you a 65-hour power reserve despite that high beat rate, and has 265 parts with a column wheel for that chronograph. And the detailing on the movement is phenomenal. It's a level of quality and detailing which you simply wouldn't see from other brands, and does challenge watches that are more expensive than this watch, such as for instance the Rolex Daytona, which doesn't have as beautifully detailed or as well pedigreed a movement as this piece. And so with a price of £7,400, of course this watch is by no means inexpensive, and does command a very significant price, but I think for the price it's highly underrated in terms of offering truly superb quality and detailing which is unique on the market. And so with that I'll conclude this video, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices for this video, because it's an interesting subject in terms of consideration across the industry and across the market. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed the video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, out.